It's now a real pleasure to hand the floor over to our first keynote speaker. Achim Steiner joins us from the Oxford Martin School, itself a hub for interdisciplinary research, where he became director in September 2016. A development economist by training, before he moved to Oxford, Achim spent a decade as UN Under-Secretary General and Executive Director of UNEP, the UN Environment Programme, where he played a pivotal role in building up UNEP's contribution to agendas around climate change, ecosystem management, innovation, and the role of the private sector. Prior to UNEP, he was Secretary General of the World Commission on Dams and Director General of the IUCN. So there are few people better placed to act as our guide through these turbulent times. Please join me in welcoming Achim Steiner. And I should say, before we give him a round of applause, in keeping with the theme of turbulence, we were told this morning by the venue that there will be not one but 5 brief fire alarm tests during Achim's talk. I've apologised profusely to him. We'd have juggled the agenda to avoid this if we'd known. So please bear with us as we go through a tortuous series of electronic signals, none of which require you to do anything other than sit still and sympathise with Achim as he battles on through. Achim Steiner.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, James. And I think the idea is probably to have a multi-sensory experience during this presentation this morning. Let me begin by saying that I will focus on some of the turbulences in a moment. But let me begin by also saying that, particularly in an audience such as you who have gathered here this morning, who spend a great deal of time trying to understand what is happening, connecting the dots on a map, bringing a new vision to how we can deal with the challenges of our times, I want to actually begin with what I was going to end my talk with, and that is to say, yes, we live in turbulent times, but actually we also live in amazing times. And this may sound a little odd when you switch on the evening news at the moment. You do sometimes have to wonder whether you're watching a Hollywood B-movie or actually watching reality unfold in terms of everyday events, statements, the political culture and language that is manifesting itself. But why do I say we live in turbulent but also amazing times? Well, we live in an age where people are more connected than ever, where societies are wealthier than ever. More technologies are available, more understanding, more appreciation, more willingness to act, and also greater capacity to act in the world is actually part of our reality today. I want to put that at the front because I think one of the roles that, particularly in a community such as you have assembled here this morning, we have to accept is that, yes, we have to be extremely concerned. I think we also have to be extremely clear and precise in describing what is happening. But our role and our responsibility is not to panic, is not to simply become part of a chorus of reacting to what is happening, but to help people appreciate, first of all, the fact that, yes, I think there has been a shock to the establishment in the sense that a large number of people, in one form or another, particularly in the OECD world, let's put it that way, have spoken to power in a way that few people anticipate, and that is disenchantment, frustration, also a sense of having lost, which I believe is one of the drivers also of this political behavior we see right now, lost a sense of control, the freedom to choose. This narrative about don't trust an expert anymore is in some ways true, but also a distraction. It's not that people don't trust experts. What they don't want is for experts to become self-appointed governors of our reality. And I think whether it was the Brexit debate, which I still think is one of the low points in politically mature debate that we have seen in Europe in recent years, whether it is the debate about globalization and this monotonous refrain over the better part of 3 decades that, it is trade that will save us all. It is liberalization that will actually allow things to succeed, and therefore you either play by the rules or you get off the train. This notion that there is a singularity of option, not options, is part of what we're now seeing, I think, play back into the political arena. people are not suddenly all xenophobic. They're not anti-global. That is certainly my conviction. And certainly much of the world is not following the trend that is playing out in some countries. And that is also important to remind ourselves of. What we are fixated with right now is very close to our reality. It is also in some ways a bigger contrast to what we have become used to as a kind of political narrative of the West. But let's also put it in perspective. As one country seems to exit the international system, the global consensus, even though that consensus was always one that stretched the imagination of some who were brought into that consensus not by being part of it, but by simply being included in it, but also by withdrawing from the international system. The new US administration is about to announce its budget, and certainly there is no clearer signal of a country saying we are taking a different direction than this budget will do when it comes to committing itself to international problem solving, to working not through the lens of security, defense and arms, but rather through cooperation, investment, solidarity, and the ability to foster development in poorer parts of the world. But, you know, Brexit, the USA, elections in Europe aside, I would say 5 to 5.5 billion people are having a completely different conversation. They are not preoccupied by what is happening in the Midwest of the United States or what will be the consequence of Brexit to, you know, Scotland or other parts of the UK. They are debating their future, their development, they're investing in their infrastructure, in their people. They're actually embracing a vision of becoming part of that global economy that some parts of the world have enjoyed from the top end of the pyramid for a long time. And the symbolism of seeing the one place that we thought would implode the minute the US would turn its back on, namely the Paris climate change process, could not have been... That's a very musical way of having a fire alarm, isn't it? Mongolian music to accompany us here.
Attention, please. We are investigating an alarm condition. It may be necessary to evacuate the building. Please listen for further announcements.
This is actually perfect, isn't it? I mean, it's like the perfect narrative. So what I'm telling you right now is don't get up and don't leave the building, right? So,
Attention, please.
oh, I see.
Attention, please.
Maybe they
We
do
are
it 5 times in a row.
investigating an alarm condition. It may be necessary to evacuate the building. Please listen for further announcements.
I bet you the minute I start, he'll be back. So all this to say that we are indeed living in very turbulent times, but this turbulence should not become a narrative of panic. I think we have to be extremely concerned. I mean, whether it is in terms of some of the xenophobia, the populism, and many of the other phenomena we're observing at the moment. But when we are talking about the future of sustainability, of sustainable development, of a global vision on how on earth will we live together with 10 billion people on this planet, there is a great deal that we can actually bring to the fore and that needs to be brought into the public domain. Last night I was in a public debate in Oxford about whether, you know, global cooperation is coming to an end and multilateralism should be replaced by, you know, bilateral initiatives and coalitions of the willing leading. And you know, sometimes I'm astonished at how precarious the commitment seems to be of those who study our international system in putting into question and even at risk something that we have built up from a moment of great pain after 1945 and
Attention, please. Attention, please.
now he's on my side. Anyway, let's move on. The idea being that in what I will present to you this morning, and I have a number of slides here, but it occurred to me as I was traveling on the train this morning, many of these slides really are the backdrop to the work that you all do. So I will not dwell on them in a great deal, but rather use them as a backdrop to perhaps demonstrate some of the things that I believe are important in informing our community that is thinking about these issues and how to move forward. So, clearly, the global in-tray is very disruptive, it is creating uncertainty, it is also signaling a degree of complexity that in some ways is unprecedented. And if you just take the most brutal news item of the last week, that we have the United Nations declaring 4 concurrent droughts. First of all, there hasn't been one declared in over 20 years, and now we have 4 concurrent droughts. In addition to the humanitarian crisis that are already ongoing, not in 70 years has the United Nations system, particularly the humanitarian system, had to cope with the storm that is currently unfolding. And as you can see before your own eyes, as the Secretary General, as the head of the World Food Programme, appeals to the world and says, look, we need to do something, it will yet again take us 3 to 6 months to actually get the attention of the world, and it is only when bodies are being buried in their hundreds that the world will suddenly provide the political reaction that will make our political leaders respond. It is tragic what will happen in the next few months. Unfortunately, it repeats itself time and time again. And this is against the backdrop of all sorts of other developments that are making people feel very uncomfortable at the moment. And therefore, the notion of a political backlash is not so surprising and is also not without precedent. Again, the financial crisis is still very much alive. You would wonder whether that is the case when you look at the Dow Jones Index or the FTSE, because interesting enough, within 2 or 3 years of the financial crisis, these indices were already almost back to as if the financial crisis never happened. But behind it lies a decade of social deconstruction, of intergenerational indebtedness, and also of fundamental disruption in the lives of millions. And part of that also manifested itself in the United Kingdom, because what was blamed very often on Brussels or on foreigners invading the British Isles, so to speak, and clogging up the social services, the health services, was actually the backdrop of the financial crisis playing itself out with 10, 20, 30, 40% budget cuts in the way that government would fund services that people had become accustomed to. So again, the confluence of these developments is disconcerting. At the same time, we are living in an age where there are simply so many more people. So yes, globalization allowed capital to flow, but just as in the European Union, also on a global level, people have been moving on an unprecedented scale in terms of numbers, distance traveled, and not just refugees. And much of that movement of capital and people has actually had net positive benefits. There is no question about that. And the economists amongst you who study this will see it. But behind that trend also lie a number of developments that were simply ignored, not acknowledged, or assumed that in a trickle-down world where everything gets larger, the fundamental vision behind GDP and market economics is that it would somehow take care of those who might temporarily be losers. And clearly, that didn't happen. And here, just a graph to show you the refugee trends, which are on top of everything else that was playing out already. Against the backdrop of a financial crisis, insecurity, we have on the top end the countries of origin and the bottom hand the countries of destination. And again, many of you may be surprised that despite the impact refugees have had on Europe in the last few years, actually 70 to 80% of the world's refugees today are hosted and supported by about 10 countries, most of which are actually least developed or developing countries. So again, we have a strange set of optics driving this discussion. Add to that climate change, which to some is still in the realm of the hypothetical. And it is striking to me that in the community of research and also public advocacy, we are still trying to solve something that clearly has gotten the attention of the world. Otherwise, we would not have a Paris Climate Agreement in terms of climate modeling and threats and essentially disruption. When really what society wants to hear from us is not what is the problem, okay, we get it, what are the solutions? Can you give us confidence that we can make these transitions to a low carbon economy? Are we not going to risk our economy, our livelihoods, the education of my children, our competitiveness in that so-called global economy? And again, I was struck last week when Professor Ramanathan gave a lecture in Oxford about the latest developments on climate. And he put one statistic that we are so used to, the 5% chance in IPCC language of moving beyond 5 to 6 degrees is something that on a graph means almost nothing to the public. And he just turned it around and said, look, if you were at Heathrow Airport this morning, putting your children on a plane, would you allow them to travel on a plane that has a 1 in 20 chance of crashing? 1 in 20 chance of crashing. That's what 5% probability in IPCC language means. So that's one way in which we can translate complexity into something that is more comprehensible, has a lot to do with communication, but we also need to understand that it is in the space of solutions that we need to start understanding how people engage or disengage. I put at the moment the rapidly shifting scientific and technological landscapes, again, as something that is disruptive and that potentially causes a great deal of unease. You may not be able to read all of this, but it goes from the natural language processing, video analytics, to robotic process automation, deep learning, sensor processing. Much of this is extraordinary in terms of the opportunity it provides. For instance, few know that according to Airbus's own estimate, 3D printing will allow them to reduce the waste of materials in building an aircraft by 80 to 90%. Just a small little fact in the economic reality of how we look at resource flows in our economy. But the main narrative at the moment is also employment, the future of work. Is this the end of a net positive growth in terms of employment opportunities? And what will happen to the next billion African citizens who will be with us in, somewhere the next 30 to 35 years? Will they even be able to find a job in this global economy? Or will Africa have to compete in the new robotic economy in order to even have a chance to perform? So the result has been, as Paul Krugman once said, financial crises are policy failures. Repeated policy failures devalue traditional sources of authority. And I think we are living through a period of that. We have to shift paradigms, and paradigm shifts bring complexity. They blur and they also introduce unpredictability. And also they give rise, particularly when the answers are not persuasive or the disruption is very real in everyday lives, to reactionary political movements arising globally that are born out of a desire for control, simplicity, safety, and order. Doesn't that sound familiar? And as Madeleine Albright once put it very, very clearly, people are talking to their governments using 21st century technology. Governments listen on 20th century technology and respond with 19th century policies. I thought this is a wonderful summary of our policy dilemma at the moment. So here is the great challenge: transitions, fundamental, very significant transitions, and complexity, and fire alarms. You should get a rebate. It's gone silent. So here's just 3 examples. I mean, we have the prolonged fiscal aftershocks, and let us not ignore these, because people are actually living the consequences of that financial crisis, and this is not without precedent if we think back to the early part of the 20th century. We have mass movements of people, and they are not just an economic phenomenon and a migration phenomenon and let's say, a political reality. They are also a psychological, a cultural challenge, an integration challenge. We have dramatic technological change, both as a threat but also as an enormous opportunity. And I would argue that issues such as sustainability or the decarbonization of our economy and the challenge of equity within societies, nations, national boundaries, but perhaps even more so globally, demands fundamental transitions. Just to remind ourselves, population trends. In Africa in 2085, there will be more people living on that continent than there were in the entire world in 1950. And that is without precedent. We are living through an age of exponential change. Food and agriculture. In a time when we need to be feeding more people, we're actually depleting the amount of arable land that is available for us to grow food. Many of these statistics are well known to you. Land use change. World water requirements, and again, I will not go into the graphs because you know them all well. World energy requirements. And the traditional response of the mainstream experts and agencies, we just have to produce more of everything. 70% more food, so much more energy. And nobody's answering the question, how on earth will you be able to explain an increase in food production of 70% over the next few decades when already we have less land available, we are running out of water in many parts of the world? It just doesn't add up. And in fact, I would argue that the food systems and food security challenge in some ways is less answered today than our capacity to actually make the transition towards a low-carbon economy in terms of technology opportunities. But here comes the story in terms of translating what is a very doomsday-like scenario narrative immediately also into multiple areas where we can intervene. The Nexus logic very much runs through this. We have just on, the most immediate opportunities for decarbonizing our economies, opportunities from changing energy systems, mobility, how we manage buildings, industrial efficiency, resource efficiency, transitions in agriculture. The world actually is full of opportunities to do things, and the reason we are not moving forward is not in some either technological or biophysical constraint. It is actually in the trappings of a legacy economy, and in some respects a governance failure, compounded by the crisis in which we are currently living, or the turbulent times. So here comes the white knight, the knight on a white horse, as you say, I think in English, with shining armor. The United Nations says, Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals. And a lot of people sort of sit back and think, what is going on? I mean, we are having extremism, nationalism, populism take over, and the United Nations thinks that, a agreed Agenda 2030 is going to make a difference. Well, I'm an unapologetic fan of the SDGs and Agenda 2030. I think they're actually extremely significant, first of all, because of when they happened. In the midst of a world that was actually beginning to lose a sense of collective interest, why is it that nations agreed for the first time on a shared agenda for development? This has never existed before. The world has been split into developed, developing economies, G77. Here we have 17 sustainable development goals with targets. They are universal and they're integrated. They are a significant shift in the sense of framing a collective interest globally. And they were agreed and negotiated by member states, not just experts. We also are beginning to see impact. Now, there is an interesting, let's say, monitoring process, for instance, through the scorecard process, that is sort of looking at how a country is beginning to work with this. And I would, again, highlight, now let me just go back for 1 second here, that the SDGs should not be misinterpreted as some form of global governance and accountability mechanism. First of all, we managed to bring the most complex group of interests together in one shared agenda. The next step is not for the UN to write reports in New York and police the implementation. It is to take these SDGs into the national and local governance processes. It is when parliaments will hold governments in terms of the executive accountable for what they have signed up. When people will, at the level of local government, but also through the courts, begin to hold their leaders responsible for commitments that are explicitly made by sovereign states to implement these goals, never mind many of the other provisions of the system of international rule of law, that's when these things become real, not in the aggregate meta-level statistical data that the United Nations, the World Bank, and so produces. These are important analytical tools. They are not the practical engagement points for the public. Now, for some of you who may have followed the work of UNEP and also have maybe heard me speak before, I think part of what will make this paradigm shift work is putting a different kind of economic vision into the public arena. And, we can debate a great deal about circular economy, green economy, ecological civilization, gross national happiness, green growth. And I don't know if Tim is here yet. I once shared a platform. Oh, there you are, Tim. Hi. A platform with him in Berlin where we debated, is the green economy in a sense flawed because it still hangs on to a notion of growth. I hope I'll listen a little bit more to what you say today with the second edition of your book. But my argument would be, we need to, first of all, give people a chance to feel they're part of reframing the economic discourse. And the higher we put the threshold of entering that discourse, the more difficult it becomes. So the notion of an inclusive green economy is in one way a fundamental challenge to economic paradigms of the last 100 years, and an opening to basically let choices, and these are social choices, societal choices, define priorities. I only want to draw your attention to it. I mean, in some ways, this is a summary of why that imperative of shifting from a traditional GDP-obsessed economic paradigm of measuring success and progress needs to transition to a different set of parameters within which we shape our economic priorities. And these are just a few slides from the UNEP work on the green economy. At the heart of this is a decoupling, both in terms of resource use, but also a impact decoupling. There are 1,001 ways in which this can be done. And in fact, in your book, Tim, you describe some of these key areas again. My earlier graph of just demonstrating the multiple areas in which we can, for instance, pursue a low-carbon economic transition is another demonstration of that. Where I think we can move from just hypothesis and theory is to describe just the last 10 years in one of the most disruptive developments that our economy has seen. Energy technologies, energy policies. For all those who think that our world is just full of problems and everything has to be defined in terms of trade-offs, which I would, at the end of my talk, suggest to you is one of the most unhelpful concepts that we use in public discourse and also in the development discourse, is to actually look at what's happening to the frontier of energy production in the world, and particularly electricity. So the patents for solar, wind, geothermal have been in the drawers of engineers, of academics, and of companies for the better part of the 20th century. When the imperative of transitioning to a low-carbon economy became increasingly accepted by some countries and a green energy policy was put in place, and not only in Denmark or Germany or now the UK, but also in South Africa, in Brazil, in China, in Kenya, we suddenly see these extraordinary developments, namely that renewables just, first of all, offer us a palpable opportunity to decarbonize our electricity infrastructure. And much to the surprise of many who spent years arguing that renewables were the luxury of the rich and would actually make access to energy more difficult for the poor, here comes China, enters the global marketplace with mass production, and suddenly the price for renewables per kilowatt hour produced drops so fast that a continent of 1 billion people, namely Africa, in which somewhere around 600 to 700 million people don't have access to electricity in this century, are now able to look at an electricity infrastructure pathway that first of all will allow a completely different model of investment and business to emerge, and secondly, probably allow hundreds of millions of people to have access to electricity decades earlier than they would have done under the traditional model of energy production. At the same time, let's be clear, this is a major disruption. 5 German energy companies nearly went bankrupt when German society said, we want to have the renewable transition, even if it costs us more, and we want to stop nuclear energy. They did not believe that this could happen, and yet it was written on the wall of those who were looking 10 years down the line very clearly. So there is also this problem that if we do not think about how we help those who sometimes legitimately have invested in a particular technology, a particular business model, to make an exit from that model, then we will probably lose a lot of time. And look at what is playing out in the United States now. I think most citizens in the United States, if presented with a rational and balanced argument of how, first of all, continuing with fossil fuel-powered systems is actually going to harm them, and secondly, that it is not impossible to make the transition, would not vote for the kind of vision that is currently being articulated as the future pathway for a US economy in energy terms. But that is where the public debate has landed us. So, looking at the headwinds, we have tough times ahead. We face both an increasingly uncomfortable public in the OECD nations about what the future will bring, both in terms of this slightly schizophrenic reality of progress in technology and R&D, and the UK is about to invest another 8 billion, if I understood you correctly, James, in robotics and automation and drones and all these things that will be amazing in terms of what they can do. But will they actually create jobs? Will they actually make disenfranchised or already frustrated communities better off? We have Africa, as I mentioned already. Few people are looking at that continent at the moment as more than a small continent full of poor people with some constant news about conflicts and humanitarian crisis. What 2 billion Africans will decide to do in their daily lives, consumption-wise, energy-wise, production-wise, resource use-wise, by the year 2030 will affect virtually every corner of this planet. And we need to focus more on Africa not only as this appendix to a global economy, but the new emerging and in some ways defining group of nations that is new to the global equation. If Africa were to choose the 20th century European fossil fuel path to its energy and electricity system, then you could indeed forget about the Paris Agreement. It would be irrelevant. So defining an agenda in terms of aid, international cooperation, technology transfer, that doesn't frame it in terms of poverty and let's just help a few African nations to provide more electricity to their people, but to say it is in the core interest of Europe and indeed the rest of the international community to enable Africa to choose a different energy and electricity generating pathway over the next 20 years is actually the way we should justify our engagement with that continent and view it as a partnership of mutual benefit and in some ways existentially relevant. Aid fatigue, always a difficult phenomenon. I am still trying to understand whether this aid fatigue is a product of the daily newspaper reporting and our inability to actually present things also, or whether it really is that people are fed up of helping others. I actually don't believe it is the latter. But we also lack the facts. We lack context and perspective. Telling a few stories of success in a couple of projects that we funded as either the UK or as an NGO is not the way to try and persuade people about aid. I think we need to start showing fundamental changes and trends and sometimes put things in perspective also. The UK spends every year over £7 billion just on keeping its pets. Now, keeping dogs and cats is, our choice. It's a very passionate thing to do. But just set that in proportion to, the aid budget, and then you have a different perspective. This notion that somehow billions of pounds are draining into nowhere take a very different meaning on when you think that, every person in the UK spends roughly, a few £100 per annum. Or the United Nations. People often say, this extraordinary organization, far too big, spends far too much money. The Fire Department of New York has an annual budget of $1.9 billion. That's what citizens of New York are willing to pay for a department that they're very proud of, that protects them. Do you know that the entire budget of the UN Secretary General and the UN Secretariat, not including the specialized agencies, is $5.8 billion a year? For working with 193 nations across the full spectrum of human rights, refugees, pandemics, and etc., etc. If you just think that a city like New York is willing to put $1.9 billion down every year to fund its fire service, maybe we get a slightly different sense of perspective of what we're actually investing in the international system. The arrival of China. Many in the West are struggling with this newfound voice. And again, one of those historic moments. President Trump assumes office and President Xi Jinping arrives in Davos. And suddenly China is the grand advocate of an open globalization process, of keeping the Paris Agreement going, and also of looking at poverty in a global and geopolitical sense as the task of richer nations. And also is charging ahead on moving towards a low-carbon economy faster than any other economy on this planet today. Now, admittedly, from a very polluting starting point, but in terms of dramatic policy shifts and the move towards an ecological civilization, I would urge you in terms of research agenda, do take a closer look of how that narrative in Asia, whether it is in China, whether it is in Bhutan, in Thailand, is playing out, because I think the frontier of sustainability systems thinking and paradigm shifts is actually rapidly moving towards Asia as being the frontier of rethinking 21st century economies and societies. Almost there, James. So there is cause for optimism. And I want to go back to this notion that sustainable development, sustainability, the Sustainable Development Goals are something that people cannot connect with. If we achieve what we have set out to do, we would deliver extraordinary progress. And even the MDGs, in their uneven performance, managed to focus a great deal of resources, energies, public policies, and in some countries really did change lives of millions of people. So failure in some countries or contexts or on some goals does not make the goals either wrong or irrelevant. I think our challenge, however, is that if we are going to be able to manage transitions and fundamental ones, such as the ones that I've just touched on briefly here, and acknowledge that complexity is part of our life. And I've often found it difficult to see when people say, oh, the SDGs are too complicated, 17 goals. I think it is almost a miracle that 7 billion people in a UN-hosted process were able to agree on 17 goals that define, let's say, the broad parameters of where we need to move together as a collective group of nations, but also individually, and put targets and indicators to work. The real challenge will be whether we can get away from the notion that every citizen in the street must be able to recite the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I think this is an absolutely misguided test of whether they are relevant. All of you have smartphones in your pockets, I assume, or most of you. Probably most of you have no clue what's inside your smartphone nor how it works. But it has become a part of your everyday life because through the interface, the apps, your ability to use this miraculous little thing that has more processing capacity than a room like this would have been full of servers in the 1960s, enables you to do things. And I think the SDGs are equally like an operating system. You and I in the street do not have to understand the operating system, but we have to understand how to use it. And that's where I go back to the notion that sustainability, the transition towards a low-carbon economy, the Sustainable Development Goals, the paradigm shifts in our economic modeling and theory of how societies will produce, consume, and impact on our planet need to be turned into things that people can work with. And when that moment arrives, we see amazing changes happening. It explains to me the phenomenon of Wangari Maathai, who inspired literally millions of people across the world to plant trees. It doesn't always take rocket science to empower people to feel empowered. It is also the reason why, opinion polls continue to show that in Germany and Denmark, 75% of citizens are in favor of the energy transition, even though it is imposing, particularly on the household and consumer level, because of a particular choice that was made in tariff distribution, quite a heavy penalty. But they believe in it, in part because it also means I can do something about climate change, and I actually feel good about it. So let me end with this notion that we live in very turbulent times, and in some countries, for the moment, very disturbing trends are emerging. But I think as a community, we both on the conceptual and the policy front, but also in the public narrative and engagement, have an extraordinary opportunity to not let extremism, nationalism, parochialism take over the narrative about what our world in the 21st century is about and how we're actually doing in 2017. And that is a big spectrum to cover, but one that I think probably many of us who are here are in a better position to do than most. And it is one reason why I accepted also the invitation to head the Oxford Martin School, because to me it was a very intriguing challenge to see how knowledge, the frontier of knowledge through science, technology and policy could actually in this particular period in history empower societies to believe in their capacity to shape their future. Thank you.
Achim, thank you very much for setting the scene so brilliantly. We will take a few questions now. We haven't got a lot of time, but given that we started late and you soldiered on through the serial interruptions so well, we definitely want to hear a few comments and questions. So we'll take probably just one round of thoughts, comments, questions to Achim. Keep them short and sharp if you can, and then we'll hear a response. If people could say who they are as well when they ask a question, that would be great. Have we got roving mics, Rose? Yes. There are some roving mics. Up the front there first.
Yes, name Les Lebedeau, Open University. I want to ask about your final slide in particular, about your grounds for optimism about future improvements in people's conditions of life and livelihoods through 2030. Well, if only that would happen, it would be a great advance. But I want to ask, under what conditions would that happen? Or that is, what conditions would be necessary? Is it simply because global agreements have been reached among governments that it's best to achieve those benefits? Or perhaps is it because social movements, NGO networks, various alliances at local, national, and global level force governments to change their current neoliberal policies, which have been moving in the opposite direction? I mean, earlier you referred to reactionary and nationalist reactions to global institutions, but those global those global institutions, including European integration, especially around the euro, have almost predictably led to the degradation of many people's lives through restrictions on state aid, through limits on budget deficits, through the disparities in productivity, which predictably led to the impoverishment of many people in Southern Europe, and so on, along lines that many of us predicted back in the 1990s, that this nationalist reactionary response would inevitably result. So I want to ask, go back to my question, under what conditions of political struggle would those improvements happen?
Great, that's how not to ask a question. Interesting as it is, Les. Thank you. Other questions at the back.
Ewan Phimister, University of Aberdeen. You mentioned just very briefly, you mentioned in your talk about the idea that thinking about trade-offs isn't very helpful. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Other hands? Yes, there.
Hello, I was just interested in your perspective on how, is this working? Your perspective on corporations and how corporates deliver the transition.
Thank you. Andy Sterling.
Thanks for a fantastic talk. Do we need to think and speak more about the largest single policy commitment worldwide, the military?
Hi, Joanne Williams in town from Columbia Business School. You mentioned, I guess, the importance of the people choosing kind of what's important and how we address sustainability issues in the future. Can you talk a little bit about what that mechanism looks like and how we actually get that done?
Thank you. And we'll take one more at the back there.
Hello, Anna, student at CAT. Linking on to that, is the Localism Act of 2011 a way to empower people to set their own agendas, the sustainable UN agendas on a local level?
Great. So a lot there, Achim, and not very long to answer, but can you give us a synthetic response to as many of those as you can?
Do you want me to stand up? Yes, maybe because the room might be a big, but don't worry, I shan't stay for long. Under what conditions would this happen? Well, hopefully much of the day today is in part about exploring those conditions. I think in what I try to show is that I think it is the confluence of multiple forces coming together. We often invoke lack of political leadership. I, in my own experience, have given up on that notion as being the trigger and the driver a long time ago. I think by the very nature of politics and how politics functions, politicians are followers, except when historical circumstances dictate through, particular moments of catharsis or post-crisis, a kind of, defying the laws of gravity political leadership vacuum. But most of the time, politicians follow public sentiment. So I think the beginning is, first of all, on the one hand, between where social movements are able to express people's preferences and choices, and therefore also their motivation to drive for change. I have quoted a few times in my life the extraordinary surprise I had when I once watched a film about the debates in the British House of Parliament on the abolition of slavery. And about 6 or 7 years ago, it was around Copenhagen, it struck me that some of the language that was being used there in order to stop the abolition of slavery was verbatim, and it was actually uncanny, verbatim the language we were using in the run-up to Copenhagen to argue why we couldn't yet deal with global warming in the way that was being proposed. What I'm trying to say with that is whether it is, the suffragettes, whether it is the climate change movement, cancelling debt, slavery, anti-apartheid movement, it starts with people who say this is just not acceptable. But then comes a whole series of other things. First of all, can you put pressure on politicians? And unfortunately, in our world, increasingly, some of the greatest challenges that I showed in the intro have as a precondition the capacity to act collectively. It doesn't always have to be global, but it certainly is increasingly regional, and it is increasingly also global. And therefore, global agreements, I think, are very important. And again, people who look to Paris as a failure because it didn't ratify the path to 80% emission reductions or a 2-degree guaranteed world, I think misinterpret also the process of reaching global agreements. This is a stepping stone, and it allows us to take the next step, which is to do an almost unprecedented thing, which is to decarbonize our entire global economy in less than half a century. I don't think there is a project in human history that is comparable. So the fact that 193 nations with very different views enter into that process with a certain degree of caution, but again, as an environmentalist, as somebody who has watched the climate debate, it's intensely frustrating. It took us 20 plus years to get to where we did in Paris. But if you look at it from a historical, civilizational point of view, it's absolutely phenomenal. In just 2 decades, we managed to take something that was in the realm of science and science fiction to many, through the IPCC, through the UNFCCC, forcing nations every year to come together in the spotlight of public attention and having to display their failure to act, to the point where they actually did act in 2015. So global agreements are part of it, but you asked also what else? And that touches on the question also of corporations. I think there is a difficult debate in our societies whether the private sector, the economy, writ large beyond the public expenditure and government budgets, is by definition a problem or can be part of the solution. I quite frankly believe that corporations, the financial markets, industry are potentially allies, and I think it is very much a question of finding the kind of regulatory environment in which societies express their preferences, set boundaries, put emphasis on certain choices that they prefer to make. And at that point, I think we can see cooperation being very much part of the solution. There's another wonderful diagram where if you take the top 10 investors in renewable energy, somewhere at slot 8 comes Walmart, before many other national economies in 2016. And many of the companies that are now part of a difficult political debate in the United States that are putting their greatest commitments on making their operations low carbon are actually significant multinational operating companies. And let me just flag only the work that we began in UNEP some years ago and that has really gotten a lot of attention. Green finance. How do we get financial markets to move from being essentially probably the biggest impediment right now to scaling up some of these transitions we discussed to actually becoming enablers of it? I think it is fundamental. We can live in denial and say, they are by definition not capable of becoming part of this agenda. I think that is actually not true. And if you look at the investment levels, over $300 billion just in 2016 in renewable energy, electricity generating infrastructure, yes, there is a significant amount of public funding, but actually there is a massive increase in private financing. And please remember, in most economies, somewhere between 15 to 20%, that's already at the high end of GDP, is actually transacted through public budgets and finance. 70 to 80% of what happens in our economies is you and me going down to the shop around the corner, but also every other activity that is not transacted through taxes. Very briefly on the trade-offs. Some of you may know that I once worked as the head of the Secretariat of the World Commission on Dams, and one of the great debates that these commissioners had about the experience of dam construction was this notion that trade-offs somehow were part of the way that development had to be conceived of, and that there will always be some losers and some winners, and maybe the failure is that we didn't look after the losers well enough. In the end, the Commission actually agreed to take the word trade-offs out of the entire report, because in part it is the notion of trade-offs defined in an unequal power structure and in the political economy of today that has been used to legitimize some of the most egregious choices and justify them in societal or developmental terms to the detriment of indigenous people, of local farmers, of communities, of people who had to be forcibly resettled. And I think part of our dilemma is that we have for far too long allowed the development discourse to present itself as if there are trade-offs to be made by some on behalf of the many. Now, that may just seem to you like an issue of nomenclature, and in some ways it is, but it is symbolic of a fundamental malaise, I think, in the development discourse, that we allow these trade-offs to be formulated as rational. There will be choices that need to be made, but those choices need to be made by all those who are affected by them, and then you negotiate outcomes that are either more just or fair or economically equitable. So I don't have time to go deeper into it, but I think we do need to perhaps think of our paradigm shift also as being one from a trade-off kind of view of the world of development to one that is complex but also driven by synergies, by a systems change, because that actually allows us to leverage multiple elements in support of the kind of fundamental transitions that are there. On the military, what can I say? As I said, the entire budget of a UN Secretary General and for the entire UN Secretariat is about 10% of the net increase of the US defense budget this coming budget cycle. And I mean, if there is one lesson that we can point to in virtually every conflict in recent years, is that deploying a military machine to solve many of these tensions that we see simply hasn't worked. And therefore, if you compare what we're willing to expend into this notion of security through military defense means, as opposed to investing in solving some of these underlying problems that often drive these conflicts, then I don't think I need to say more. I mean, at the same time, there is a great psychology on which people play. The threat is out there. It's always what politics does when it is under pressure. And therefore, the more you can put that threat out there, the more you can legitimize also the kind of narrative that says through walls, through defense budgets, through greater military engagement, we can avoid things. And let me just say to you, please take a moment and read some of the statements of the new UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. It is the counter thesis to that narrative that he stands for. And I think it is vital at this moment in time that the voice of the UN Secretary General is recognized for what it is, namely to stand beyond national narratives for some fundamental principles and truths that need to be articulated. Otherwise, people won't hear anything else. On the mechanisms of how people can choose, in one sense, we have more choice and more capacity to choose and more information at our disposal today. We are just 2 or 3 years away from being able to walk down the supermarket aisle with our smartphone and literally be able to track the full life cycle of the product we will buy. I was in a major British store just a few weeks ago buying a fridge. But I was also astonished that in the year 2017, as a normal consumer walking into a shop who wanted to buy a triple plus A-rated utility, a fridge and a freezer, first of all, there was only one being offered at A triple plus. All the others were somewhere around A plus and down in terms of energy efficiency rating. And the cost for buying the A triple plus was roughly 40 to 50% more than the next piece of equipment being made available. So this is still the reality of the consumer in 2017. You want to do the right thing. First of all, it's a lot more effort. Secondly, you pay through your nose for the privilege of actually doing something that is of collective benefit for society. And that's where our regulatory system is simply not moving fast enough. And we have 1,000 ways in which we can empower people to make better choices. And the first one is to correct these distortions in the way that we tax and subsidize. And from then on, I think people inherently don't want to do things that harm their next of kin, their neighbor, or future generations. But without choice, whether it is a person in a drought who has to cut down the last tree or kill the last livestock in order to survive, or the person who basically says, look, I can either do the right thing and pay a lot more and indebt myself or not, these are the choices that I think often disempower the capacity of the public to make a choice. And on the Localism Act, I don't feel very competent to comment, but I will now find out more about it. Thank you.